The theater buzzed with excitement, its grand lights glowing brighter than ever. But no one noticed the old man in the worn coat stepping inside. His eyes scanned the walls, lingering on a hidden plaque no one seemed to care about anymore. They laughed at him, dismissed him. But soon they'd realize the truth. He built this place, and tonight, his legacy would speak louder than their mockery. His silence carried years of sacrifice. Subscribe to hear the stories that truly matter. The night was alive with the buzz of excitement. Bright marquee lights bathed the street in a golden glow, casting a warm sheen over the gathering crowd. Men in tailored suits and women draped in elegant evening gowns mingled outside the grand theater, their laughter and chatter mingling with the distant hum of traffic. The air smelled of fresh popcorn, crisp autumn leaves, and a faint trace of rain that had passed hours earlier. Among the glamour and vibrancy, a man walked alone, unnoticed. He wore a simple, weathered coat that hung loosely over his frail shoulders. His hat, tilted slightly forward, shadowed his eyes, but his face bore the unmistakable lines of a life well lived, lines etched deep with both sorrow and resilience. He gripped a cane, not so much for support, but as a quiet companion to his steady stride. No one turned to look at him. He moved like a whisper through the crowd, stepping over puddles and dodging the occasional glance of disinterest. The theater loomed before him, a magnificent structure of intricate carvings and polished glass. It stood proud, almost defiant against the march of time. The man paused at the foot of its steps, his gaze lifting to the marquee above. The name of the show flashed in bold letters, but his eyes didn't linger there. Instead, they drifted to the edges of the building, where the remnants of its original charm remained hidden beneath layers of modern renovations. A soft sigh escaped him, and for a moment, his hand trembled on the cane. He tightened his grip and straightened his posture. Though his movements were slow and deliberate, he looked around, observing the faces of those streaming past him. No one met his eyes. They were too caught up in their own chatter, their own excitement. As he climbed the steps, the golden glow of the theater's light spilled onto his face. It revealed something more, a flicker of recognition, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He entered the grand lobby, its opulence spreading before him like a painting. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above a sea of velvet carpets and marble columns. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, but the man remained silent, letting his gaze sweep across the space with an air of quiet familiarity. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was sharp and impatient. A young usher in a neatly pressed uniform stepped into his path, blocking his way. The man paused, his cane resting lightly on the floor. "Yes?" he asked softly, his tone calm and measured. "Are you lost?" The usher's eyes darted over the man's simple attire, his gaze betraying a mix of pity and suspicion. "The main entrance is for ticket holders only." The man tilted his head slightly, as though amused by the question. "No, I'm not lost," he replied, his voice carrying a quiet assurance that didn't match his appearance. The usher hesitated, glancing back at the crowd of patrons who were beginning to take notice. A few giggles erupted from a nearby group of young men in tailored suits. One of them smirked, leaning toward his friends. "Wrong decade, old man," he whispered loudly enough for the words to carry. The man didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the chandelier above, its light dancing across his weathered face. Slowly, he turned his gaze to the young usher, offering a faint smile. "Funny," he said, almost to himself. "People rarely take the time to see what's in front of them." Without waiting for a response, he moved past the usher, his steps unhurried but purposeful. Behind him, the giggles turned into faint murmurs, and the young usher stood frozen, watching as the man disappeared deeper into the theater. The man continued through the lobby, his steps guided by a memory that seemed to live within the walls. The noise of the crowd softened behind him, fading as he entered a quieter corridor. This part of the theater was less polished, its charm untouched by the glossy renovations that had transformed the main lobby. The carpets were faded but familiar, the kind that told stories of countless evenings spent welcoming dreamers and storytellers. He paused beside a wall lined with photographs, his eyes scanning each one with deliberate slowness. The photos were black and white, capturing moments frozen in time, smiling actors, packed audiences, and grand performances from decades ago. His gaze stopped at one image, smaller and more worn than the rest. It showed a group of men and women standing in front of the theater on its opening night. He was there too, standing slightly to the side, his younger self holding a tool bag in one hand. His fingers brushed against the edge of the frame, a faint tremor in his hand as the memories flooded back. That photograph was taken just before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a moment he hadn't planned to attend. He had been so busy hammering down last-minute fixes to the stage that someone had practically dragged him outside. "Excuse me, can I help you?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, wearing a staff badge. Her expression was polite but cautious, her eyes flicking from his hand to the photograph. "No," he replied softly, pulling his hand back. "I was just looking." The woman hesitated, then glanced at the photo he'd been staring at. "That's one of the originals," she said. "This theater has such a rich history. Did you know it was one of the first in the city to feature an all-local cast back in the 60s? "I know," he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "I was here." Her brows knit together in curiosity. "Really? Were you part of the crew or something?" He smiled faintly, as though the answer amused him. "Something like that." Before she could ask more, the sharp sound of laughter echoed from the lobby, pulling her attention away. She offered a quick, apologetic smile. "Enjoy the show," she said before hurrying off. He watched her go, his smile fading. Turning back to the photograph, he tapped his cane lightly against the floor, the sound reverberating softly through the empty corridor. His reflection stared back at him in the glass frame, older and worn, but with eyes that still carried the fire of the young man in the photo. "Some things don't change," he murmured to himself. He moved on, leaving the photograph behind, but it felt as though a piece of him lingered there, trapped in that moment of history. The hallway opened into a side lounge, a space quieter than the bustling main lobby but no less elegant. Plush armchairs lined the walls, and a grand piano sat in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the dim golden glow of the chandelier above. The old man paused, his eyes sweeping over the room as if searching for something, or someone. A small group of well-dressed patrons occupied one corner, their laughter cutting through the stillness. Their voices carried, snippets of their conversation spilling into the empty air. "Did you see him? That old guy walking around like he owns the place," one of them said, his tone dripping with amusement. "Probably wandered in from the street," another replied. "Poor thing doesn't know this isn't a shelter." The old man turned his head slightly, their words reaching him despite the distance. He tightened his grip on his cane, but his face betrayed no emotion. He took a step forward, his shoes pressing into the soft carpet, the sound barely audible. "Excuse me, sir," a voice called out behind him. He stopped and turned to see a young man in a sharply tailored uniform approaching. The badge pinned to his chest identified him as a manager. His expression was polite but strained, a carefully practiced smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Are you lost?" the manager asked, his tone light but with an undertone of condescension. The old man met his gaze, his calm demeanor unshaken. "No, I'm right where I'm supposed to be," he replied. The manager's smile faltered for a moment before he quickly recovered. "I see. Well, this area is reserved for guests of the evening's performance. Do you have a ticket?" "No," the old man said simply. "Ah," the manager said, his polite facade slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of irritation. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to return to the main lobby then." The old man's eyes lingered on the manager for a moment before shifting to the wall behind him. A painting hung there, depicting the theater in its early days. Its golden frame gleamed under the chandelier's light, but the edges of the canvas were faded, as though time had tried to erase its story. "This theater," the old man said softly, his voice carrying a note of nostalgia. It used to be different. The manager raised an eyebrow, confused by the sudden comment. I wouldn't know. I've only been here a year, but it's been a jewel of the city for decades. It wasn't always like this, the old man continued, almost as if he hadn't heard the response. It was rough, raw, but it had heart. People came here not for glitz or glamour, but for a chance to create, to dream. The manager's polite smile faded entirely. I'm sorry, sir, but do you know what's behind that wall? The old man interrupted, pointing with his cane toward the painting. The question caught the manager off guard. Behind the wall? No, I don't. Why? The old man smiled faintly, a hint of mischief in his expression, just wondering if anyone remembers anymore. Before the manager could respond, the laughter from the corner grew louder, the mocking voices cutting through the air like glass. The old man's gaze shifted to the group, lingering on them for a moment before he turned away. I'll find my own way, he said quietly, his tone carrying a subtle weight of finality. Without waiting for the manager's reply, he walked toward the far end of the lounge, his figure disappearing into the dimly lit corridor beyond. Behind him, the faint murmur of voices followed, but he paid them no mind. His focus was elsewhere, drawn to the memories that seemed to live in the very walls of the theater, memories that refused to be forgotten. The corridor led him deeper into the theater, where the air felt cooler and carried a faint scent of old wood and dust. The polished marble floors of the lobby were replaced with worn wooden planks, creaking softly beneath his measured steps. The walls here were adorned with vintage posters, their edges yellowed with age. The names of long-forgotten plays and performers stared back at him, their bold lettering a reminder of a time when this place wasn't just about entertainment. It was about breaking boundaries. The old man stopped in front of a large poster, its frame slightly crooked. The image depicted a smiling young woman holding a bouquet, her eyes bright with determination. The title beneath read, A New Dawn, a World Premiere. His lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment his eyes softened. You're still here, he murmured under his breath, almost as if addressing the poster. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his moment of reflection. A young woman emerged from a side door, her arms full of papers and binders. She was dressed in casual black attire, clearly part of the production crew, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She glanced up and paused when she saw him, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. Are you lost? She asked, though her tone lacked the dismissive edge he'd heard earlier. He turned to face her, his smile lingering. No, he said, just revisiting some old friends. Her gaze followed his to the poster, and she tilted her head slightly. That's one of the older productions. I've seen this poster 100 times, but never knew much about it. She shifted the papers in her arms, freeing a hand to point at the title. Was it any good? He chuckled softly, the sound low and rich. Good? It was more than good. It was bold. Too bold for its time, maybe. She squinted at the small print at the bottom of the poster. Written by Peter Evans. I don't think I've ever heard of him. You wouldn't have, the old man replied, his voice tinged with a quiet fondness. He didn't write for fame. He wrote because he believed in something. He believed in giving people a voice. Her eyes flicked back to him, curiosity deepening. Sounds like you knew him. He nodded slowly. You could say that. I knew him very well. The young woman hesitated, her gaze scanning his face as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Before she could ask more, the faint sound of a bell echoed through the corridor, signaling the start of the evening's performance. I'd better get back, she said, adjusting the papers in her arms. Enjoy the show, sir. I intend to, he replied, his tone carrying a subtle note of amusement. As she disappeared down the hallway, he turned back to the poster, his smile fading into something more reflective. She would have loved to see this, he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the frame before he straightened, his gaze shifting further down the corridor. The faint strains of music drifted through the air now, signaling that the performance was beginning. But he wasn't here for the show. He was here for something far more important. With a deep breath, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. The theater, in all its grandeur and transformation, held pieces of him, pieces he hadn't revisited in years. Tonight, it seemed, those pieces were calling him back. The hallway opened into a narrow stairwell, its steps leading downward into the dim underbelly of the theater. The light here was muted, casting long shadows on the walls. The old man paused at the top of the stairs, his hand resting on the banister. For a moment, he simply stared down as if debating whether to continue. His fingers tightened on the wood, and he took the first step, the creak of the old stairs filling the silence. The further he descended, the more the air seemed to change. It was cooler here, heavier, and carried the unmistakable scent of damp wood and forgotten spaces. Memories surfaced with each step. A rehearsal here, a late-night brainstorm there. This was where the theater's heart had once beat strongest, far away from the glitz and glamour above. At the bottom of the stairs, he reached a small, unassuming door. The paint was peeling, and the brass handle was worn from decades of use. He paused, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the space was almost unrecognizable from the bustling world above. It was the old green room, the walls lined with faded mirrors and empty makeup stations. The furniture was sparse and outdated. A few wooden chairs, a small table with scuffed legs. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed for years. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. His gaze swept across the room, landing on a corner where an old trunk sat, partially hidden beneath a sheet. He walked toward it, his cane clicking softly on the floor. Pulling back the sheet, he revealed a weathered leather trunk, its metal corners tarnished and its lock rusted. Kneeling down with some effort, he opened the trunk. The hinges groaned in protest, and the scent of time, of old paper, fabric, and memories rose to meet him. Inside were the remnants of a life once lived here, handwritten scripts, faded playbills, a broken stage prop, and a photograph tucked carefully beneath it all. He lifted the photo, holding it up to the dim light. It showed a young man, barely in his 20s, standing beside the stage. He was smiling, his hands stained with paint, a hammer tucked into his belt. The old man stared at it, his expression unreadable. "You always said this place would be something," he murmured, his voice soft and filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. And it was. For a time, a faint sound reached his ears, the distant echo of applause from the theater above. It was muffled, but it carried the energy of an audience captivated by the magic of the stage. He placed the photo back in the trunk, his hand lingering on it for a moment before closing the lid. Rising to his feet, he glanced around the room once more. The walls seemed to whisper with echoes of the past, lines of dialogue spoken long ago, the hum of rehearsals, the laughter of a cast celebrating a successful performance. It was all still here, hidden beneath the layers of dust and neglect. As he turned to leave, his gaze caught on a small plaque mounted on the wall, partially obscured by shadows. He walked toward it, brushing away the dust with his sleeve. The words engraved there were simple, almost understated. Dedicated to the dreamers who made it possible. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment his hand trembled. Then, with a quiet resolve, he straightened his back and turned away. He climbed the stairs once more, his steps heavier than before, but his resolve unshaken. He wasn't done yet. There was still one last thing to do. As he emerged from the stairwell and re-entered the theater's main corridors, the old man's mind was far away, swimming in the memories stirred by the green room. The applause from the ongoing performance echoed faintly through the walls, a reminder of the energy pulsing above. He stopped for a moment to steady himself, leaning against his cane. His fingers curled tightly around the polished wood, as a flicker of something sharp crossed his expression. Not anger, but a deep, unspoken grief. The corridor ahead was lined with more photographs, some newer, some older, but none that seemed to matter as much as the ones hidden in the basement. He moved past them without stopping this time, his focus shifting toward the faint hum of voices growing louder as he neared the lounge. When he stepped back into the opulent space, the group of mocking patrons from earlier was still there. They hadn't noticed his return, too absorbed in their conversation. Their laughter was louder now, accompanied by the clinking of glasses. One of them, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and a tailored navy suit, gestured grandly as he spoke. "You know, theaters like this are relics," he said with a smirk. "They dress them up, but they're just monuments to outdated ideas. Places like this only survive because people are too nostalgic to admit they're past their prime." His companions chuckled, nodding in agreement. Another chimed in. "You're right. It's all a facade. I bet half the people here don't even care about the history. They just want a good selfie for their socials." The old man's footsteps slowed as he listened, his face calm but his eyes sharp. He stood on the edge of the lounge unnoticed, watching as their words filled the air. The young manager from before was near the group, standing awkwardly, clearly unsure how to intervene or whether he even should. The man in the navy suit raised his glass, his voice booming with a feigned air of wisdom. "To progress," he declared, smirking, "and to leaving the past where it belongs, buried." At that, the old man stepped forward, his cane tapping against the polished floor. The sound was subtle but deliberate, enough to draw the group's attention. The laughter trailed off as their heads turned toward him, confusion flickering across their faces. "Funny thing about the past," the old man said, his voice calm but resonant, filling the space despite its softness. "It doesn't stay buried for long, not when it's built on something real." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And you are?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled disdain. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, the weight of his silence pressing down on the group. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the walls of the lounge where paintings and plaques adorned the space. His eyes landed on one in particular, half hidden by the shadows cast by the chandelier above. Without a word, he began walking toward it, his cane clicking rhythmically with each step. The group exchanged puzzled glances, their smugness giving way to curiosity. The young manager, sensing the tension, followed hesitantly, keeping a small distance. The old man stopped in front of the plaque, his back to the group. Reaching up, he brushed away a thin layer of dust that had gathered on its surface. The gold lettering beneath shimmered faintly in the dim light. Founded by Peter Evans, a visionary and dreamer. Turning slowly, he faced the group once more. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "You asked who I am," he said, his voice steady. "I'm the man who built this place. I'm the reason you're standing here tonight." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of his words. The group stared at him, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. The man in the navy suit opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Behind them, the young manager's eyes widened as the realization sank in. The old man tilted his head slightly, his faint smile returning. "It's easy to mock what you don't understand," he said. "Easier still when you've never had to build something with your own hands." His gaze lingered on the group for a moment longer, before he turned away, his steps unhurried as he began walking toward the main hall. Behind him, the group remained frozen, their voices silenced by the weight of his revelation. The old man stepped into the main hall, the grandeur of the theater's interior unfolding before him. Rows of plush red seats descended in elegant arcs toward the stage, where a spotlight illuminated the performers mid-scene. The audience was enraptured, their attention glued to the performance, their collective silence broken only by an occasional gasp or muffled applause. He stood at the entrance for a moment, leaning on his cane as he took it all in. This was the beating heart of the theater, the place where dreams materialized and stories came to life. But to him, it was more than that. It was a culmination of every struggle, every late night, and every moment of doubt he had endured to bring this place into existence. His eyes scanned the audience, moving instinctively to the private box seats along the upper balcony. Those seats hadn't changed in decades, still reserved for the theater's most esteemed guests. The memories came rushing back unbidden. The nights he had stood there, watching performances he had helped bring to life, his heart swelling with pride as the audience erupted into applause. But the box seats were full of strangers now, their faces unfamiliar. Time had moved on, and so had the people who had once filled this theater with their passion and dedication. He felt a pang of something, loss perhaps, or a deep yearning for the days when this place had truly felt like his. "Excuse me, sir," a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a young usher standing a few steps away, her expression polite but tinged with curiosity. She glanced at the empty seat in the back row closest to the entrance. "Would you like to sit here? It's a great view of the stage." The old man's lips curved into a faint smile. "No, thank you," he replied gently. "I'm not here for the show." The usher hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "Are you with someone? Or part of the production team?" He shook his head. "No, I'm just passing through." His tone was calm, but his words carried a weight that made her pause. "Well," she said after a moment, offering a tentative smile, "if you need anything, let me know." "Thank you," he replied, nodding slightly. The usher left him, disappearing into the shadows near the edge of the hall. The old man turned his attention back to the stage, watching as the actors moved across it with precision and grace. Their voices filled the room, their energy palpable even from a distance. He lingered for a moment longer, then turned away, heading toward a smaller door to the side of the hall. The door led to a stairwell that spiraled upward, the steps worn from decades of use. He climbed slowly, his cane tapping against each step, the sound echoing faintly in the narrow space. The ascent was steady but purposeful, each step carrying him closer to a place he hadn't visited in years. At the top of the stairs, he reached a door marked with a simple brass plate. Founder's Suite. The lettering was elegant but understated, as though it had been deliberately designed to avoid drawing too much attention. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, the suite was exactly as he remembered it. Quiet, intimate, and filled with the faint scent of aged wood. The room was small but meticulously designed, with a single chair positioned near the large window overlooking the stage below. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents a mix of theater history and personal journals, some of which bore his name on the spines. He walked to the chair and lowered himself into it, his movements slow but deliberate. From this vantage point he could see the entire stage, the performers moving like shadows against the bright lights. He leaned back, his cane resting across his lap, and let out a quiet sigh. This was his theater, his vision brought to life. And yet, as he sat there, he realized how much it had changed, and how much of it had stayed the same. The applause from the audience reached him faintly, a sound both distant and familiar, like the echo of a memory that refused to fade. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to sit in that moment, to feel the weight of what he had built, and the distance that now separated him from it. But the night wasn't over yet. There was still more to do. The applause from the audience grew louder, surging in waves that reverberated through the walls of the Founder's Suite. The old man sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the stage below as the performers bowed, their silhouettes illuminated by the spotlight. The sound filled the air, a crescendo of admiration and gratitude, but none of it reached him in the way it once might have. His gaze shifted from the stage to the crowd, scanning the faces in the audience. They were strangers, every one of them. He wondered how many of them knew the story behind this place, how many understood the sacrifices, the sweat, and the sleepless nights it had taken to make it real. Probably none. To them, it was just another beautiful theater, a place to escape into stories that weren't their own. A quiet knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said softly, his voice carrying across the stillness of the room. The door opened, and the young staff member he had spoken to earlier stepped inside, her eyes wide with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. She held a small notebook in her hands, its edges worn, as if it had been used countless times. "Sorry to bother you," she began, her voice hesitant. I wanted to ask you something." He gestured for her to come closer, his expression kind but unreadable. "Go ahead." She approached slowly, stopping a few steps away from him. Her gaze flicked to the bookshelves lining the walls, her curiosity momentarily overtaking her nervousness. "This room," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like a museum, but no one ever talks about it. Why is that?" He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Because people forget," he said simply. "Time moves forward, and the stories that matter most are often left behind." She hesitated, glancing at the notebook in her hands. "But you didn't forget. You remember everything, don't you?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her. There was something in her tone, an earnestness that set her apart from the others he had encountered that evening. "What makes you think that?" She held up the notebook, her fingers brushing over its cover. "I found this in the archive room last week. It's full of sketches and notes about the theater. Floor plans, costume designs, even little snippets of dialogue. They're all signed by someone named Peter Evans." The room seemed to grow quieter, the weight of her words hanging in the air. His smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. "You've been doing your homework," he said after a moment, his voice measured. She nodded quickly. "I'm a history student," she admitted. "I started working here part-time to help with the archive project and, well, I just got curious. There's so much about this place that doesn't match the official records. It's like there's a whole other story no one's telling." His eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "You're right. There is another story, one that doesn't fit neatly into programs or brochures." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're Peter Evans, aren't you?" The question hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable. He didn't answer right away, his gaze turning back to the stage. The performers were taking their final bows now, the applause rising to its peak. Finally, he looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." Her breath caught, her eyes widening in awe. "But why don't you tell people? Why let them think it's just another theater?" His smile returned, faint but full of meaning. "Because it was never about me," he said. "It was always about what this place could give to others, the stories it could tell, the lives it could change. That's what matters." She stared at him, her mind racing with questions, but the sound of footsteps outside the door interrupted them. Someone was approaching, the brisk, purposeful stride of someone important. The old man turned his head slightly, his expression shifting to one of quiet amusement. "Looks like it's time to finish this evening properly," he said, rising slowly from his chair. The young woman watched as he straightened, his posture steady despite the years that weighed on him. There was a sense of gravity in his movements, as if he carried the history of the theater within him. As the door opened, he stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the floor. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The footsteps grew louder, purposeful and steady, until the door swung open fully. Standing there was the theater's general manager, a middle-aged man with neatly combed silver hair and a sharp black suit. His face carried the composed confidence of someone who believed they were always in control, though his narrowed eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion at seeing the old man in the founder's suite. "I wasn't aware we had anyone scheduled to use this room tonight," the manager said, his tone clipped but polite. His gaze shifted between the old man and the young woman, who instinctively stepped back. "May I ask who you are?" The old man turned to face him fully, his cane lightly tapping the floor as he adjusted his stance. There was no trace of nervousness in his expression, only the quiet, steady confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "You may," he replied calmly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. The manager's eyebrows lifted slightly at the response, and for a moment he hesitated. Something about the old man's demeanor unsettled him. "Well then," he prompted. The young woman took a step forward, her voice trembling slightly. "This is Peter Evans," she said quickly. "He's—" The old man raised a hand gently, silencing her. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I can speak for myself." The manager frowned, the name clearly sparking recognition, though it was clouded with disbelief. "Peter Evans," he repeated slowly, his tone skeptical. "As in, the founder of this theater?" The old man nodded, his gaze steady. "The same." For a moment the room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. The young woman looked at the manager expectantly, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and unease. The manager, on the other hand, looked like he was grappling with the impossibility of what he had just heard. "That's not possible," the manager said finally, forcing a strained smile. "Peter Evans founded this theater decades ago. He would be older?" The old man finished for him, a hint of dry amusement in his tone. "You're not wrong." The manager stared at him, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more guarded. "If that's true," he said cautiously, "why haven't you come forward before now? Why would you walk in tonight like a stranger?" The old man tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Because I wanted to see what this place had become without the fanfare, without the titles. Sometimes it's better to let a story tell itself." The manager's composure faltered, and he glanced at the young woman as if seeking confirmation. She nodded quickly, her voice rushing out. "It's true. I found his notes in the archive. The designs, the original plans, they all match. He's Peter Evans." The manager's mouth opened, then closed again. He seemed at a loss for words, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of the revelation. "Now," the old man said, his tone growing firmer, "if you're done questioning me, I believe there's something I need to say to everyone here tonight." The manager blinked, startled. "To everyone? You mean the audience?" "Yes," the old man replied simply, his eyes glinting with a quiet determination. "And I expect your help in making that happen." The manager hesitated, but the authority in the old man's voice left little room for argument. Finally he nodded, his professionalism kicking in. "Of course," he said, his tone subdued. "I'll arrange it immediately." The old man inclined his head in acknowledgement. As the manager left the room, his footsteps hurried now, the old man turned back to the young woman. "You believe in history, don't you?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. It's why I started working here." "Good," he said with a faint smile, "because tonight we're going to make sure this theater remembers its own." He straightened his posture, gripping his cane tightly as he prepared to follow the manager. Outside, the applause from the audience had begun to fade, signaling the end of the performance. But for the old man, the night's most important act was about to begin. As the old man descended the stairs from the founder's suite, the theater's pulse seemed to change. The applause had died down, replaced by the soft hum of conversation as patrons milled about, preparing to leave. The air buzzed with the satisfaction of an audience entertained, their laughter and chatter filling the grand lobby below. The young woman walked alongside him, her steps quick and slightly uncertain as she glanced at him for reassurance. The old man, however, moved with quiet purpose, his cane tapping against the polished floor in a steady rhythm. His face, though weathered, carried an expression of calm resolve. When they reached the lobby, the general manager was already waiting at the foot of the stairs, his phone pressed to his ear. He gestured sharply to a technician nearby, pointing toward the stage. The technician nodded and disappeared into the crowd, weaving through the clusters of patrons. The manager ended his call and turned to the old man, his demeanor visibly more subdued. "The stage is being prepared," he said. "The house lights will stay up, and the audience is being asked to remain seated for a special announcement." The old man nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze scanning the room. The crowd was thick, filled with people laughing and sharing their thoughts on the evening's performance. None of them paid him any mind. He was just another face in a sea of strangers. He stepped forward, his cane tapping with each deliberate stride. The young woman stayed close behind, her hands clutching her notebook as though it were an anchor. The moment he entered the theater's main hall, the murmur of conversation began to shift. Heads turned, first a few, then more, as people noticed the unusual procession. The general manager followed at a slight distance, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a quiet deference. The old man approached the stage, his steps slowing as he reached the stairs that led up to the spotlight. A technician extended a hand to help him, but he waved it off, gripping the banister and climbing steadily on his own. The stage was empty now, the performers gone and the props cleared. The spotlight hung in the air, a single beam illuminating the center of the stage. He moved toward it, his cane echoing softly in the vast silence of the theater. The crowd watched in confusion, their conversations fading into a low murmur. Some glanced at one another, questioning who this man was and why he had taken the stage. The old man stopped in the center of the light, straightening his posture as much as his frame would allow. He let the silence stretch for a moment, his eyes scanning the audience. He could feel their curiosity, their growing need to understand. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm but commanding. It carried through the hall, soft yet unmistakably firm. The crowd stilled, their attention sharpening as if pulled by an invisible thread. "For many of you," he continued, "this theater is a place to escape, a place where stories come alive, where performers transport you to worlds far removed from your own. And that's exactly what it was meant to be, a sanctuary for dreams." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But what you see now is only part of the story. This place, this theater, was not always what it is today. There was a time when it was nothing more than a decaying shell, a forgotten building that no one believed in." Murmurs rippled through the audience, their curiosity growing. He took a deep breath, the weight of his next words heavy on his chest. "Decades ago, I was just a young man with a vision. I saw potential where others saw ruin. I didn't have money, connections, or influence, only a belief that this place could be something extraordinary. So, I worked, I built, I sacrificed." His voice wavered slightly, but he steadied himself. "And when the doors opened for the first time, this theater wasn't just mine. It belonged to every dreamer who had ever felt overlooked. It was a home for those who wanted to create, to tell their stories, to be seen." The murmurs in the audience ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so profound it felt tangible. "I am Peter Evans," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I am the founder of this theater, and tonight I'm here to remind you of what it truly stands for." Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief and awe mingling in their expressions. The young woman at the edge of the stage clutched her notebook tightly, her face alight with a mixture of pride and reverence. The old man let the silence linger, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. Then with a faint smile he added, "Because history, no matter how forgotten, has a way of finding its voice again." The applause started slowly, scattered across the hall, but it quickly grew, swelling into a thunderous ovation that echoed through the theater. He stood there, the light framing him like a living portrait, his presence a testament to the enduring power of dreams realized. This was his stage, his story, and his legacy, and tonight it belonged to him once more. The applause surged like a wave, filling every corner of the theater and reverberating off its ornate walls. The old man stood in the spotlight, his figure small yet commanding in the vast space. For a moment he allowed himself to absorb the sound, his gaze moving over the crowd. Their faces, once filled with confusion and skepticism, now reflected admiration and awe. He raised a hand, and the applause gradually softened, then faded into a respectful silence. The theater, which moments before had been alive with clamor, now felt intimate, as though the space itself had leaned in to hear him speak. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying warmth but also gravity. "Thank you for your applause. Though I must tell you, I did not step onto this stage tonight seeking your praise. I came to remind us all, myself included, why this theater exists." He gestured with his cane, sweeping it gently across the expanse of the stage. "This isn't just a building. It isn't just a stage. It's a living testament to what people can create when they dare to believe in something bigger than themselves. It's a place that has seen failure, triumph, heartbreak, and joy, all of it woven into its very foundations." The audience was silent, their attention rapt as though each word struck a chord deep within them. "There were nights," he continued, his tone softening, "when I thought this dream might collapse, when the challenges felt insurmountable. There were people who laughed at the idea of a man like me, someone without power, wealth, or status, building a place like this. But I believed. I believed that art, storytelling, and shared experience could bridge gaps that words alone could not." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of distraction but of connection. He could see it in their eyes, the spark of understanding, of shared humanity. "This theater," he said, his voice growing firmer, "was never about me. It was and always will be about you, about the stories that you carry, the dreams that you nurture, and the connections that you forge here. Tonight, as I stand before you, I see not just an audience but the continuation of something far greater than any one person." His gaze shifted to the young woman standing by the edge of the stage, her notebook still clutched to her chest. "And I see hope," he said, his words directed as much to her as to the crowd. "Hope that this place will continue to inspire and transform long after I am gone." The audience remained silent, their emotions visible in their expressions. Tears glistening in some eyes, quiet smiles breaking across others. The old man let his words settle before he stepped forward slightly, his figure framed perfectly in the glow of the spotlight. "So tonight," he said, his voice steady, "I leave this stage not as its founder but as its keeper. Because legacies are not about holding on to the past, they're about lighting the way forward." The applause came again, rising faster this time, filling the space with a thunderous roar. He nodded once, a small but significant gesture, and stepped back from the center of the stage. The young woman rushed to meet him, her face glowing with pride. "You were amazing," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He smiled, his eyes warm but tired. "The theater is the amazing one," he replied. "I'm just its messenger." As the audience continued to cheer, he made his way down the stage steps, his cane tapping rhythmically. The crowd parted instinctively as he walked back into the lobby, a quiet hum of reverence following in his wake. This time, no one looked at him with doubt or disdain. Instead, they gazed with respect, their whispers carrying his name like a song passed through the air. Peter Evans, the man who built their sanctuary, the man who reminded them of its soul. As the old man stepped into the lobby, the energy of the audience followed him like a tide, swirling with whispers of awe and curiosity. Some stopped mid-conversation to watch him pass, their eyes wide with recognition, while others murmured his name as though it were a secret that had just been revealed. Peter Evans. He moved slowly but deliberately, his cane tapping against the marble floor, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in the minds of those around him. The young woman walked beside him, her notebook still clutched to her chest, her expression a mix of pride and quiet determination. "Mr. Evans," a voice called out hesitantly from the crowd. He turned to see a middle-aged man stepping forward, his suit immaculate, but his demeanor unexpectedly nervous. The man extended a hand, his face flushed. I just wanted to say what an honor it is to meet you. What you said in there, it was inspiring, truly." Peter shook his hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone warm but measured. Before he could take another step, more people began to approach. An older couple, a group of young theater students, even a few members of the staff who had watched him earlier with skepticism. "Mr. Evans," one of the students said eagerly, her voice trembling, I can't believe I'm meeting you. I've read about your work in my classes. You're a legend." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "A legend," he repeated, his voice carrying a note of humor. "I'm just a man who built something with his hands. The rest is what the world decided to make of it." "But it's more than that," the student insisted, her eyes shining. "You've given so many people a chance to tell their stories, to be heard." He paused, her words striking something deep within him. "And that," he said quietly, "is all I ever wanted." The crowd around him grew thicker, the once dismissive audience now transformed into admirers, eager to hear more, to express their gratitude, or simply to bask in his presence. Yet Peter, despite their admiration, seemed distant, his gaze flickering past their faces to something only he could see. "Excuse me," he said gently, raising a hand. The crowd parted instinctively, their respect evident in the way they stepped aside. He turned to the young woman beside him. "Come," he said softly. "There's something I want to show you." She nodded quickly, falling into step beside him as he began to move toward a smaller, less conspicuous hallway at the edge of the lobby. The murmurs of the crowd followed them, but no one dared interrupt. The hallway was dimly lit, its walls lined with old photographs and plaques commemorating the theater's history. He stopped in front of one photo in particular, its edges yellowed with age. It showed a younger version of himself standing in the middle of a group of workers, their faces sweaty but triumphant. The theater loomed behind them, half-built but unmistakably full of promise. "This," he said, gesturing to the photo, "was the beginning. We didn't have much, just a vision and a lot of hard work. But we believed in it, and that was enough." The young woman stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "You never gave up," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "No," he replied, his voice low. "But there were times I wanted to, times when the weight of it all felt impossible. And yet," he trailed off, his eyes lingering on the faces in the photograph, "and yet we pushed forward, because we knew this place was meant to be more than just bricks and mortar. It was meant to be a sanctuary." She turned to him, her expression full of admiration. "It still is," she said. "You can feel it. Everyone who walks through these doors feels it." He smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's good to hear," he said, "because a theater without a soul is just an empty room." They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the hallway wrapping around them like a cocoon. Finally, Peter straightened, his grip on his cane tightening. "Come," he said again, his voice firm but kind. "There's still one more place I'd like you to see." As they walked deeper into the theater, the energy of the night seemed to shift. This wasn't just a journey through the building. It was a journey through time, through the heart of a legacy that refused to be forgotten. The hallway narrowed, leading them to an old wooden door at the very end. Its surface was worn, the paint chipped away in places to reveal the grain of the wood beneath. A brass plate affixed to it read, "Archives," though the letters were faded and barely legible. Peter paused in front of the door, his fingers brushing over the handle. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, his expression distant. Then, with a quiet breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room inside was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, casting a soft glow over rows of shelves packed with boxes, binders, and rolled-up blueprints. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed only by the slight draft from the open door. The smell of old paper and wood filled the space, a scent both nostalgic and melancholic. The young woman followed him inside, her eyes widening as she took in the sheer volume of history stored here. "I didn't even know this room existed," she said, her voice hushed. "Few do," Peter replied, his tone thoughtful. "When the renovations began, I made sure this room stayed intact. It's the only part of the theater that hasn't been touched since it was built." He walked to a shelf near the center of the room, his cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. Reaching out, he pulled down a large, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn with age. He held it carefully, almost reverently. before setting it on a nearby table. The young woman stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" she asked. "A record," he said, opening the book to its first page. The handwriting inside was neat and deliberate, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Every decision, every challenge, every milestone, documented from the very first day we broke ground. She leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the pages. The entries were meticulous, detailing everything from the cost of materials to the names of the workers who had helped build the theater. She paused at one entry that read, March 15th. Construction delayed due to lack of funding. Considering selling off personal assets to continue. The dream must not end here. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You sacrificed so much," she said softly. "You risked everything." Peter's gaze remained on the book, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the page. "Dreams often require sacrifice," he said. "But it wasn't just me. Everyone who worked on this place believed in it. We weren't just building a theater, we were building a promise. A promise that stories, no matter who told them, would always have a home here." The young woman turned the page, her eyes falling on a sketch tucked between the sheets. It was a rough drawing of the theater's facade, the words, "A place for all," scrawled at the top. "You designed this," she said, holding it up. He nodded. "Late one night, sitting in a cramped room with nothing but a pencil and a dream. It was the only way I could see past the doubt." Her voice trembled with emotion. "And you made it real." Peter smiled faintly. "We made it real," he corrected. "It took a community, a family of believers, to bring this place to life. And it will take the same kind of belief to ensure it thrives long after I'm gone." She looked at him, her admiration clear. "You've already ensured that. Just by being here tonight, you've reminded everyone what this theater stands for." He closed the book gently, the sound of its cover meeting the table echoing softly in the quiet room. "Perhaps," he said, "but legacies are fragile things. They need caretakers, people who understand their importance and carry them forward." Her grip tightened on her notebook, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll be one of those caretakers," she said firmly. Peter studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his smile returning. "Good," he said, "because this theater isn't just its past, it's its future." He turned toward the door, his steps slow but steady. The young woman followed, casting one last glance at the archive room before the door closed behind them. As they walked back toward the main lobby, the faint echoes of the night's applause seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that the story of the theater was far from over. The journey back to the lobby felt heavier, not because of fatigue, but because of the weight of what had been shared. The theater's secrets, its struggles, and its triumphs were no longer just Peter's burden to carry. The young woman walked beside him, her expression thoughtful, her notebook clutched tightly as if holding on to everything she had learned. As they approached the bright lights of the lobby, the crowd had thinned, with only a few patrons lingering in small groups. The general manager stood near the grand staircase, his phone in hand, issuing quiet instructions to the staff. When he saw Peter and the young woman returning, he straightened, his face a mask of professional deference. "Mr. Evans," the manager said, stepping forward. His tone was more respectful now, the skepticism from earlier completely gone. "The announcement you made tonight has already sparked interest. Several people have asked if we plan to host a tribute, or perhaps an event to honor the theater's history and your legacy." Peter tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "A tribute?" he echoed. "This theater doesn't need a tribute. It needs stories, new ones, told by fresh voices who will shape its future." The manager nodded quickly, though his discomfort at the answer was evident. "Of course," he said, "but surely a celebration of its past, of your contributions, would help remind people of what this place represents." Peter regarded him thoughtfully, his fingers tapping lightly on the handle of his cane. "Perhaps," he said after a moment, But let's not focus too much on the man who built the stage. Let's focus on the stories that have yet to be told upon it." The young woman glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was clear that his words, both on the stage and now, had resonated deeply with her. The manager hesitated, then inclined his head. "As you wish, Mr. Evans," he said. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." Peter nodded, his attention already shifting. His eyes roamed the lobby, lingering on the details he had once known so well. The carved wood of the ticket counter, the vintage light fixtures that still hung overhead, the faded corners of a mural that told a story few remembered anymore. He turned to the young woman. "Do you see it?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but deliberate. She looked at him, puzzled. "See what?" "The soul of the theater," he said, gesturing subtly to the space around them. "It's there if you know where to look. It's in the echoes of every performer's first steps onto the stage, in the nervous excitement of an opening night, in the applause that reverberates long after the curtains fall. It's in the stories, both the ones we tell and the ones we live." She followed his gaze, her eyes sweeping over the space with a newfound awareness. Slowly, she nodded. "I see it," she said softly. Peter smiled, a flicker of satisfaction passing over his face. "Good," he said, "because it will take people like you to keep it alive." The manager, sensing the conversation's end, stepped forward once more. "If there's anything else we can do for you tonight, please let me know," he said. Peter shook his head, his grip on his cane tightening slightly. "No, thank you," he replied. "You've done enough. Now it's time for the theater to do what it does best, welcome those who need it." With that, he turned toward the doors, his steps slow but purposeful. The young woman hesitated for a moment, then hurried to follow him. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the glow of the marquee lights illuminated the street. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving the city quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Peter paused on the steps, looking up at the marquee. The name of the evening's performance shone brightly, but his attention was drawn to the small inscription beneath it. "A place for all." He smiled, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Still here," he murmured to himself, the words carrying both relief and pride. The young woman stood beside him, her notebook still in her hands. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice tentative. Peter glanced at her, his eyes twinkling with something between mischief and wisdom. "That depends," he said. "Will the theater still need me?" "It will always need you," she replied, her tone resolute. He chuckled softly, his breath fogging in the cold. "Then perhaps I will," he said. "But only if it also needs you and others like you to carry it forward." With that, he turned and began walking down the steps, the sound of his cane tapping against the stone fading into the quiet night. The young woman watched him go, her notebook pressed against her chest, knowing that this moment, like so many others in the theater, was a story worth remembering. Peter walked slowly down the dimly lit street, the glow of the theater's marquee casting his retreating figure in warm light. The sounds of the city were distant now, a faint hum of life moving forward as it always did. His steps were deliberate, each one a quiet punctuation mark in a night that had turned into something far more profound than even he had expected. Behind him, the young woman lingered at the theater's entrance, watching until his silhouette blended into the shadows of the street. She felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to follow him and ask all the questions that still buzzed in her mind. Yet she stayed rooted to the spot, the weight of what he had entrusted her with, his story, his vision, settling on her like a gentle but firm hand. Peter turned a corner and stopped at a bench beneath a flickering street lamp. It was old, its paint chipped and its surface marked by years of wear. He sat down with a quiet sigh, resting his cane against the armrest. For a moment, he stared at the pavement, his mind a swirl of memories. He thought of the theater's early days, how the community had rallied around his dream despite the odds. He remembered the late nights spent hammering nails and painting walls, the laughter of the workers echoing through the empty shell of the building. And he remembered the opening night, the way the audience's applause had filled every corner, affirming that all their efforts had been worth it. But beneath those memories were others, heavier ones. The doubts that had crept in during the hardest times, the moments when he had wondered if he had been foolish to dream so big. The sacrifices, financial, personal, and emotional, that had often left him questioning whether the theater would ever truly belong to the people he had built it for. He looked up at the sky, the stars faint against the city's glow. "You'd be proud," he murmured, as if speaking to someone unseen. "It's still standing. It's still alive." A cool breeze swept down the street, rustling the leaves in the gutter and carrying with it a sense of quiet reassurance. Peter closed his eyes for a moment, letting the night wash over him. He didn't need applause or recognition to feel fulfilled. The theater itself was enough. It always had been. Back at the theater, the young woman finally tore her gaze from the empty street and stepped inside. The lobby was nearly deserted now, save for a few staff members tidying up and the general manager, who was busy giving instructions to a technician. The energy of the night had shifted from its earlier buzz to a quieter hum, the kind that lingered after something meaningful had occurred. She approached the manager cautiously, her notebook still in her hands. "Sir," she said, her voice hesitant. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Yes? What is it?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "About what Mr. Evans said tonight. I think we should do more than just preserve the theater's history. We should share it." The manager raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but unsure of where she was going. "Share it how?" "Through the performances," she said, her confidence growing as she spoke. "We could produce a play about the theater's story, about its founding, the struggles and the vision behind it. People need to know what this place stands for. They need to feel connected to it." The manager tilted his head, considering her words. "That's an interesting idea," he said slowly. "It could draw attention, bring in new audiences, and deepen our connection with the community." She nodded eagerly. "Exactly. And it wouldn't just be a tribute to Mr. Evans, it would be a way to remind people that this theater was built for them, for their stories." The manager studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll take it to the board," he said. "It's a compelling idea, but you'll need to write up a detailed proposal, something concrete we can present." "I'll do it," she said immediately. "I'll start tonight." He smiled faintly, impressed by her enthusiasm. "Good. Let's see what you can come up with." As he turned back to his work, the young woman clutched her notebook tightly, her mind already racing with ideas. She felt a spark of excitement, the kind that came from knowing she was on the verge of something important. Glancing once more toward the doors, she whispered under her breath, "I won't let you down, Mr. Evans." And with that, she headed toward the archives, ready to begin weaving the next chapter of the theater's story. Peter sat quietly on the bench, his cane resting beside him, and watched the city unfold around him. The streets had emptied, the hurried pace of life slowing under the weight of the night. In the stillness, he felt a deep sense of contentment, the kind that came only after decades of struggle and perseverance. His work, his dream, had endured. As he sat there, the faint sound of footsteps approached. He turned slightly, and to his surprise, the young woman appeared, her notebook still in hand. She hesitated a few feet away, her breath visible in the cold air. "You're persistent," Peter said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. She smiled nervously, stepping closer. I couldn't let the night end without saying thank you. For everything." He nodded, his eyes warm as they met hers. "And what are you thanking me for?" "For believing in something when no one else did," she said. "For building more than a theater. For giving people like me a reason to dream." Peter leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to the horizon. "You remind me of myself," he said after a moment. "Hungry to create, eager to make a difference. That's what this place needs, people with fire in their hearts, willing to do the hard work." She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll do the work," she promised. "I'll make sure the theater continues to inspire, just like you envisioned." He smiled faintly, his expression a mix of pride and wistfulness. "Then I've done my job," he said, "because this place was never meant to be mine alone. It was always meant to belong to those who believe in it." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their conversation hanging gently between them. The young woman looked down at her notebook, her grip tightening as though she were holding on to more than just paper and ink. "Will you come back?" she asked quietly. Peter chuckled softly, the sound low and rich. "I think my part in this story is done," he said, "but that doesn't mean I won't be watching." She nodded, her heart heavy yet full of determination. "I'll make sure it's a story worth watching," she said. He gave her a small, approving nod, then pushed himself up from the bench with a quiet groan, his cane steadying him. "Good," he said simply. As he began walking down the street, his figure gradually fading into the night, the young woman stood rooted to the spot, her notebook pressed to her chest. She knew, deep in her heart, that she had just witnessed the passing of a torch, and she was ready to carry it. The young woman returned to the theater, the quiet of the empty building wrapping around her like a warm embrace. The grand space, which had felt so overwhelming earlier, now seemed alive in a different way, filled with the echoes of its history, the whispers of stories yet to be told. She made her way back to the archive room, flipping through her notebook as ideas poured from her mind. She envisioned the play she would write, the proposal she would present, and the conversations she would have to ensure the theater's legacy endured. Sitting at the old wooden table in the archive room, she placed her notebook down and opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote in bold letters, "A Place for All," the story of Peter Evans and the theater that changed everything. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. "This is just the beginning," she murmured, a quiet smile spreading across her face. Above her, in the main hall, the theater sat in silence, its grand stage bathed in moonlight streaming through the high windows. Yet within its walls there was a new kind of energy, a spark that had been reignited. Far away, Peter Evans walked alone, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. His shoulders were straight, his steps steady. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. The theater and the dreams it held were in good hands now, and the city, the night, and the theater itself seemed to breathe in unison, ready for the stories yet to come. The theater lights may dim, and the applause may fade, but the stories they hold never truly end. Peter Evans built more than walls and a stage. He built a legacy, a sanctuary for dreamers and a reminder that resilience can create miracles. Tonight, his story has reignited the soul of a place meant to inspire generations. But this isn't just Peter's story, it's yours too. It's about the courage to believe in something greater, to push forward when the world doubts you, and to leave behind a legacy that matters. The question now is, what story will you tell? Don't let this moment pass. Hit subscribe to join us in uncovering more stories that remind us of the power of dreams. Share your thoughts in the comments, because every voice deserves to be heard. Together, let's keep these legacies alive and continue to inspire the world. Your story starts here.